When everything falls silent, truly silent, you begin to realize how much of your life has been a performance. The noise, the constant talking, the endless scrolling, the need to be seen, all of it was camouflage against the unbearable weight of meeting yourself. And in that silence, when there's nowhere left to hide, the truth steps forward, not gently, but with the quiet force of revelation. Silence is not merely the absence of sound. It's the most honest presence you'll ever encounter. It strips away the camouflage of constant noise, the endless chatter that fills our minds and environments, and it leaves you alone with yourself, which is precisely why it terrifies people. When everything else falls away, when there's no distraction left to hide behind, silence begins to speak. It speaks in truths that are hard to hear. It reflects you back to yourself in a way that no other experience can, and for many, that reflection is unbearable. Because in silence, you don't get to perform. You don't get to curate your image. You don't get to distract yourself with the approval of others. You simply have to confront the person you've become when no one's watching. You see, we live in a time when people are almost allergic to silence. The moment a room grows still, they reach for their phones, their playlists, their conversations, anything to avoid that crushing weight of being alone with their own thoughts. But silence, real silence, is not the enemy. It's the mirror. And the mirror doesn't lie. It shows you the dissonance between who you are and who you pretend to be. It shows you where you've compromised, where you've acted out of fear rather than conviction, where you've betrayed your own potential because you wanted comfort instead of truth. That's why it's so agonizing. It confronts you with yourself, without mercy, without distraction, without excuse. People often imagine that silence is empty, but it isn't. It's full of everything we've avoided addressing. It holds the unspoken thoughts, the unresolved conflicts, the lingering guilt. It amplifies the whisper of conscience that we spend our lives trying to drown out. And that whisper, that small, persistent voice, it tells you the truth about your life, whether you want to hear it or not. In silence, that voice becomes deafening. And that's why many can't stand it. Because to hear it is to realize that the story you've been telling yourself about who you are might not be true. The histrionic, the one who lives for attention and external validation, experiences this most acutely. For them, silence is annihilation. Their identity depends on being seen, and when no one's looking, they begin to unravel. But that unraveling isn't just a punishment, it's an opportunity. Because if silence can strip away everything false, then what remains, however small and fragile, is the beginning of something real. It's the seed of authenticity. The mirror of silence is not cruel for cruelty's sake. It's revealing the truth that has to be faced if you ever want to become whole. And so, when you stand before silence, it's like standing before a sacred mirror. You begin to see the faces you've worn to impress others, the lies you've told to feel accepted, the compromises you've made to avoid being alone. You see how much of your life has been built around avoiding this very moment, the confrontation with the truth of your own being. That realization cuts deep because it exposes how dependent you've become on the noise, on the performance, on the applause. And yet, it's precisely in that moment of exposure that the possibility of transformation begins. Silence does not flatter. It doesn't offer consolation or distraction. It simply reflects. And if you're willing to look into that mirror long enough without turning away, you begin to recognize the contours of your soul beneath the distortions of fear and vanity. You begin to understand that truth isn't found in the noise of the world, but in the stillness that lies beneath it. Silence, then, is not the absence of meaning, it's the space where meaning is finally allowed to emerge. When a person builds their identity on performance and validation, they construct something fragile, something inherently unstable. It's like building a house on a foundation of mirrors. It may shimmer and reflect light beautifully, but it can't bear the weight of reality. Every action, every word, every expression becomes calibrated, not to express truth, but to elicit a reaction. Life becomes a stage, and the self becomes an actor who has long forgotten the original script. You begin to perform even when you're alone, because the habit of performance becomes inseparable from who you think you are. The tragedy is that the moment the audience leaves, you have nothing left. The show collapses, and so do you. Validation is intoxicating. It's a drug that mimics the feeling of self-worth without ever providing it. You get a dose, a compliment, a like, a nod of approval, and for a fleeting moment you feel alive. But it fades quickly, and the emptiness returns, demanding the next fix. The pursuit of that approval becomes endless, and with every performance, you move further from authenticity. You start to live in service of perception, not truth. You measure your existence through other people's eyes, and every silence, every moment of disinterest feels like an existential threat. That's the collapse, the recognition that without external affirmation, you don't know who you are or whether you matter. What's worse is that this dependence on validation disguises itself as confidence. You look composed, articulate, successful even, but underneath there's a constant trembling, the fear that if people really saw you, they'd withdraw their approval. So you keep performing. You refine your mask. You tell yourself it's strategy, that you're adapting to your environment, but deep down you know it's fear. You fear being unseen because you suspect that what's real in you isn't enough. And yet, that's the most corrosive lie of all. Because it's precisely that hidden, unperformed self that's capable of genuine strength, depth, and meaning. The collapse of identity built on performance doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small moments when someone doesn't respond the way you expected, when silence follows your efforts to impress, when admiration turns to indifference. Each instance chips away at the illusion until one day you're left with the unbearable recognition that the persona you've invested in so deeply has no life of its own. It can't love. It can't suffer honestly. It can't grow. It can only repeat what once worked, hoping for the same applause. And this is the paradox. The very thing you believe sustains you being seen, being approved of, is the thing that prevents you from existing in any real sense. Because the self that depends on external eyes to survive isn't living. It's reacting. It's not creating. It's performing. And when that performance finally collapses, when the stage goes dark, the silence that follows isn't just quiet, it's the sound of a false self dying. To endure silence is to stand in the presence of something vast, unyielding, and uncomfortably honest. It demands a strength that few cultivate, because silence reveals rather than conceals. When all the noise of the world fades, the opinions, the obligations, the distractions, you're left with nothing but the rawness of your own being. And in that stillness, everything you've ignored about yourself begins to rise to the surface. The insecurities you buried, the guilt you rationalized, the potential you neglected, all of it becomes visible in the quiet. This is why people flee from silence. It strips away the narratives you tell yourself and replaces them with truth, unfiltered and unflattering. The process of uncovering genuine selfhood begins there, in that confrontation. Because it's in silence that you're forced to ask, who am I when there's nothing left to prove? Most people can't answer that. They've spent years constructing an identity based on what's acceptable, impressive, or safe. They've become reflections of expectation rather than expressions of truth. But silence dismantles that construction brick by brick. It holds up a mirror and demands that you see yourself not as you wish to be seen, but as you actually are. That's not comfortable. It's humiliating at times. But it's real. And reality, though harsh, is the only ground on which a genuine life can be built. To endure silence requires discipline because it's not passive. It's active engagement with the truth of your own condition. You begin to see the gap between what you say you value and what your actions actually reveal. You start to notice the noise you create, the way you talk just to avoid feeling alone, the way you fill time to escape reflection. And as you sit longer with that discomfort, you realize that silence is not empty at all. It's full of meaning, but only if you have the courage to listen. That listening is what begins to transform you. It's the birth of self-awareness. Silence doesn't demand performance, it demands presence. It asks that you inhabit yourself fully, that you stop pretending and simply exist. And when you do that, when you allow yourself to be still without distraction, you start to meet the person underneath all the layers of noise. That person is often fragile, uncertain, wounded, but also capable of remarkable depth and resilience. You can't discover that self through constant stimulation or approval seeking. You discover it only through stillness, through solitude, through the courage to let silence speak louder than your impulses. When you can endure silence without reaching for escape, something begins to shift inside you. You stop being at war with yourself. You stop needing to be entertained, validated, or distracted. You begin to hear the faint rhythm of your own conscience, the quiet intuition that points toward what's meaningful and true. In that space, selfhood stops being a performance and becomes an experience, one grounded in truth, humility, and the unshakable calm of someone who no longer needs to run from themselves. Conscience is not a loud voice. It doesn't shout or demand attention. It whispers, and it whispers only in silence. It's the quiet internal presence that knows what's right even when every external force tells you otherwise. But most people never hear it because their lives are filled with too much noise. The endless commentary of others, The pressure to conform, the constant barrage of distraction, it drowns out that still, small voice that could guide them toward meaning. The tragedy is that conscience never disappears. It waits, patient and persistent beneath the noise, speaking softly to anyone who dares to listen. To hear conscience, you must first create the conditions for its voice to emerge. That means stillness. That means the courage to stop moving for long enough to feel the weight of your own being. When you become silent, truly silent, the voice of conscience starts to rise like a distant echo. At first, it's almost imperceptible, a sense of unease when you betray your principles, a subtle pull toward honesty when lying would be easier. But the more you listen, the clearer it becomes. And what it tells you isn't always comforting. Conscience doesn't flatter. It doesn't soothe your pride or justify your actions. It exposes, it reveals where you've fallen short of what you could be. It reminds you of promises broken, of potential wasted, of truths avoided. That revelation can be unbearable because it confronts you with your own moral incompleteness. It makes you see that the chaos in your life is not only external but internal, born from your refusal to listen to the one part of yourself that cannot be corrupted. The more you avoid it, the louder your inner turmoil becomes. Anxiety, resentment, and confusion are often the symptoms of a conscience ignored. They're the psychological consequences of living out of alignment with what you know, deep down, to be right. Silence removes the distractions that numb you to that realization. It takes away the excuses and forces you to reckon with yourself as a moral being. Conscience speaks in silence because it requires humility to hear it. It requires you to admit that you are not who you should be, not yet. That recognition is painful, but it's also sacred. Because the moment you acknowledge it, you open the door to transformation. You stop defending your flaws and start confronting them. You stop justifying your compromises and begin to correct them. That's why conscience is so quiet, because it's not interested in dominating you. It's interested in guiding you. It speaks in proportion to your willingness to listen. To cultivate that listening, you have to be brave enough to fall still and let conscience have its say. That's when you begin to feel something different from guilt, something cleaner, deeper, more purposeful. You begin to sense that morality isn't imposed from the outside, it's born from within. It's the part of you that aligns with truth itself, the part that knows meaning can only be found through honesty, responsibility, and the courage to do what's right even when no one is watching. Redemption doesn't come through comfort, it comes through confrontation. To be redeemed is to be stripped of illusion, to have every falsehood you've depended on torn away until only the truth remains. That's what silence does. It destroys the layers of deceit that you've built to survive, to impress, to feel secure. It removes the props of validation and approval and leaves you standing naked before reality. That kind of exposure feels cruel at first, as though the world itself were conspiring to dismantle you. But it isn't cruelty. It's mercy disguised as emptiness, because only when the illusions die can something genuine begin to live. The illusions we cling to are seductive. They tell us we're already fine as we are, that the discomfort we feel can be fixed with distraction, with attention, with achievement. But that's a lie. The illusions exist to protect the ego from seeing its own fragility. They allow us to maintain a performance of control while quietly decaying inside. Silence exposes this. It reveals that much of what we call strength is posturing, that much of what we call happiness is avoidance, and that much of what we call identity is imitation. When those illusions collapse, it feels like death, because in a way it is. The false self dies screaming, and it takes with it all the stories that once made you feel safe. But beneath that collapse is something incorruptible. When illusion is gone, what remains is reality in its purest form, raw, difficult, and alive. That's where redemption begins. You start to see that truth, however painful, is a form of liberation. The lies you've told yourself, the masks you've worn, the identities you've crafted, they were never protecting you. They were imprisoning you. And when silence takes them away, when you have no audience to deceive and no noise to hide behind, you begin to sense something sacred emerging in the wreckage. It's not the self you imagined. It's the self that's been waiting beneath all the noise, the one capable of integrity, courage, and humility. This destruction of illusion is the necessary precondition for rebirth. You can't create something real while still clinging to what's false. You can't build meaning on deception. Redemption is not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming honest. It's about facing the chaos you've avoided and accepting that truth is the only foundation solid enough to stand on. That process hurts because it dismantles everything superficial, but what grows in its place is unshakable. It's not dependent on approval, not swayed by failure, not undone by solitude. It's grounded in reality. When silence becomes the instrument of this destruction, it teaches you that emptiness is not absence but potential. The void left by illusion's death isn't barren, it's fertile. It's the soil from which authenticity grows. What feels like loss at first is actually the clearing of space for something greater, something truer, something capable of bearing the full weight of existence without collapsing under pretense. If this message resonated with you, if it stirred something real, something you've been avoiding or longing to face, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel,